Venezuela, with its extraordinarily rich oil reserves, is now crippled by debt, and has started to default on bond payouts. Maduro's spin on the situation is to claim that he is restructuring foreign debt, slowly renegotiating terms with Russia so far, Venezuela's lender of last resort, and China. A tweet from Delcy Rodriguez, a long-term servant of the successive Chavez and inspired governments, reads that Venezuela has initiated a successful refinancing of its debt. An imperial blockade will not tarnish Venezuela's financial prestige. Black, it seems, is white as far as the brutal regime goes. But not on the bond markets, and not for ratings agencies. Repayments of £200 million have been missed, and credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's has declared the country to be in selective default. It is joined in this verdict by fellow agencies Fitch and Moody's. What does this mean for the holders of what have been described as hunger bonds? And what might it mean for the starving people of what was once considered the shining economic jewel of Latin America? There are two main reasons why the IMF, the world's lender of last resort, which bailed out Greece and Ukraine among others in recent years, will not be stepping in to aid a Venezuelan default anytime soon. One is the U.S. its sanctions regime against, and attitude towards the oppressive regime of President Nicolas Maduro, supposed heir to Hugo Chavez, is hostile. The other is the sheer amount of money involved. Even if there were a regime change which was sufficient to satisfy the US's objections, the scale of the funds required to restructure the country's finances is vast. IMF multi-year programs are limited to 435% of a country's quota, that's an amount it can access based on its relative position in the world economy. In practical terms, that would mean $23 billion over 3 to 4 years for Venezuela. It needs more like $32 billion a year. In order to get that level of funding, Venezuela would need what is known as exceptional access to the IMF's cash. This was allowed in the case of Greece, but it was extremely controversial, and led by a desire to keep the Greece within the European Union, and save banks reliant on the euro currency. 7 years on from the initial agreement for the IMF to release funds to Greece, handing over the final tranche of it at the turn of 2017 was hotly contested, with the U.S. Congress calling for European institutions to solve the Greek debt crisis on their own. The idea that the same magnitude of allowance would be made, while any trace of the Chavista revolution, the socialist movement sanctioned against by the U.S. for decades, remains in Venezuela, is highly unlikely. The U.S. would simply veto any such move. It's also worth noting that, while speculation as to the scale of any Venezuelan bailout is rife, it cut the last of its ties with the IMF in 2007, which means that attempts to gather intelligence as to the real state of its economy are seriously curtailed. Bondholders who are owed $60 billion. Which, while it sounds obvious, some exposure to debt may have reached quite surprising places. Most money has been moving on the secondary bond market as the U.S. stepped up sanctions against deals with the Maduro regime. The largest institutional holders of Venezuelan debt are Fidelity Investment, $572 million, T.